Hello and welcome to Murder Analysed. I'm Christina Moore. Now today's case is a follow-on of the Mark Tydesley case, which I put up the other day. And in that case I mentioned Jason Swift and Barry Lewis, who were both victims of this paedophile gang. So in this video I'm going to talk about the murders of Jason Swift and Barry Lewis together, the circumstances around their death, but also the involvement of these paedophile gangs and other paedophile gangs in this area, and what really happened then, and why these paedophile gangs were disbanded. And it's not because of what people think, because the police were after them. That is not it. So again, in this case, there is content of child sexual abuse, paedophilia, murder, gang rapes of children. It is a shocking case, but this is the last in this series of these sex gang related murders. And I know that some people have been really distressed over the content of the last video. So again, I put out a warning to you, and again I've now put up another, I'm going to put up a slide to remind you. So if this sort of murder, whether you think you can handle it and you find it difficult to, switch off. If you do watch it and you feel that you can't get this sort of thing out of your mind, and listen, I researched this stuff, so it's very difficult even for me. I need to take a break from it. And what I usually do is either I watch a Christmas movie, something nice, or a comedy, to then get this stuff out of your mind. But for me, I think my feelings on these cases, coming from a legal perspective, is they need to be told. But even so, the content still affects me. And this is how I deal with it, is one, by then writing about it and then doing these videos to share this information with you, but also then to try and do something happy that makes you smile, that takes your mind off it. So if this content of this video is not for you, this disturbing content, please switch off now. So today, in this case, I'm going to talk about Jason Swift's case. He was 14 at the time of his death, and Barry Lewis, who was 6 at the time of his death. So let's now think about, it was November 1985 when this group led by Cooke had each paid £5 to have sex, or group sex, gang rape sex, with Jason Swift. Now Jason Swift was a runaway, 14. He is said to have been a homosexual, but he was still only 14. And I think he just didn't fit in, or he wanted more out of life, and he decided to run away from his sister's home. And as a lot of kids did in them days, he went to join the fairs. They travelled around. He wanted to see things. He travelled around. And I think what happened to Jason was then he was what we would now call groomed. And grooming in them days wasn't around. But now we know how these paedophiles influence children from quite a young age. And just because Jason Swift may have been homosexual, he didn't deserve what these people did to him. He was entitled to have a life, a normal life as a homosexual man, not to be murdered by a group of paedophiles, sexual offenders of children, for their own sexual gratification. So these groups, again, as I said, sort of groomed him. They took him in, they groomed him, and made it seem like, I think with a lot of these kids in these gangs, and as we talk about these sexual predator, paedophile gangs at the time, were influenced by also gang members that had children and were also brought up within that life to think that this was normal. Once they then had got into this, they couldn't say anything. They were very young children. And I think this is what happened with Jason Swift. He was so groomed into this lifestyle that yes, he may have been a willing participant, but we don't know. This is just what this gang are saying within this group orgy, as it was described in the papers at the time. But these men would then come, and these sometimes were high profile men, would come and pay £5 to not only sleep with Jason Swift, but with other young boys. Some very, very young boys. Now, I think Cooke said about Jason Swift's murder that it was accidental. You know, it was an orgy that had gone wrong. And we'll talk about Cooke a little bit later in this and the others in this, but if you'd already watched Mark Tysley's case, then you would know about Cooke, but we go into a bit more detail here about Cooke. So he says that Jason was then being gang raped by about 8 men, maybe even 12. He can't really remember, but something went wrong. And then he talks about the last moments of Jason's life within this flat, and we'll go into a bit more detail about that, where this attack was happening, where he was being strangled and gurgling, and then the police interviewer asked him, you know, can you repeat that? Because I don't think the police at the time could believe what they were hearing. And he stood up straight in the chair and done it again. It's like he was reliving it. So this boy had a terrible death. Again, he had been groomed. He had now got into this paedophile gang, and his then body was found in a shallow grave, naked, and he had been strangled and sexually abused. Also drugged, because this was a thing with this with these groups at the time, that they would give them muscle relaxants or Valium to help allow them then to do what they wanted to these children. So after the body was found, and I think the body was found by a dog walker, and this sort of set off the Metropolitan Police then onto this investigation into finding, you know, you could definitely clearly see it was a murder, and they started looking, and I think it led them then to Cooke and also to 3 other perpetrators in that crime. But as I say, there was more, but these are the perpetrators in that crime that was charged with then murder or manslaughter of Jason Swift, because do you remember, he, you know, it was a sex orgy that had gone wrong, even though the boy was 14. So Cooke's 3 accomplices were Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and another man called Steven Barrell. And Cooke was sentenced at the Old Bailey to 19 years, and he was in Wandsworth Prison on the 12th of May of 1989 for manslaughter of Swift. Now, manslaughter. So he's told the police that this is what happened. It was strangling, you know, in this sex orgy had gone wrong, and this boy was gurgling, but he still got manslaughter. So he got 19 years, or so you think. That will come in a bit later on as well. But at the same time as this was going on, another young lad had been taken from London, and that his name was Barry Lewis, and he was 6 years old at the time of his abduction. And the same fate as what happened to Jason happened to Barry. So Barry Lewis, age 6 at the time of his abduction, was taken by a man called Leslie Bailey. Now again, if you'd watched the last case of Mark Tinsley, you would know about Bailey, but we will go into more detail about Bailey in a little while. Now Bailey abducted Barry Lewis from London, and then wanted him to be took back as part of this sex gang, because this is what they did. They abducted children or groomed children to use them as playthings, really, for their own sick games and sex orgy games, and men paid £5 to have sex with these children. And Barry Lewis, age of 6, was their next victim on their list. So Barry Lewis was abducted in June 1991 by Leslie Bailey. Now, Leslie Bailey was also convicted with his part in the murder of Jason Swift and in the murder of Mark Tilsley. So now we have this gang and multiple now people coming into these gangs and different gangs. Barry Lewis, age 6, was abducted in June 1991 by Leslie Bailey. Now, Leslie Bailey was 37 at the time, and he states that he did abduct Barry from the streets and was taken then to this certain flat in London, where they then had arranged to have a sex gang party where men would pay the £5 to sleep with this child. So they needed to get a child now, because they have arranged this party, but they needed a child, what they would call fresh blood, or chickens. When they'd speak on the phone, they would call these kids chickens. It's like hunting for chickens. That's the mindset of these people. Then abducted Barry, drove then Barry, or tried to drive Barry to this flat, but run out of petrol. So Barry and Bailey, now Barry, little Barry Lewis, only 6, had already been drugged in this car with this muscle relaxant, with this Valium type cocktail they mixed up, one to knock this child out, and it is said that this boy would have been unconscious at this stage anyway, but he's run out of petrol now, Bailey, and he's trying now to think what to do. So he gets the petrol can out of the stolen car, he picks Barry up out of the stolen car and starts to walk along a road. Now a passerby and a man driving by was like a school teacher, and he stops and asks, "Oh, is everything all right?" And he says, "Oh, don't worry, he's just unwell and he's asleep, so he's just unwell, but I've run out of petrol." This man then takes Leslie Bailey and Barry to a petrol station. Bailey gets out of the car, fills the can up, takes the child back to the car, and then drives off. That was the fate of Barry Lewis. It was sealed at that point. Now this man, and you talk about 1991, this sort of thing, who would think that a man walking along the street with a child that's asleep, and he says it's his child, that this man is abducting this child? He never thought that, and you can understand why he wouldn't think that, because it's so blatantly in your face that it would be something that you just wouldn't think about. Yes, the man had concerns for the boy. Was he okay? But he was asleep. The boy never woke up and said anything. He was asleep because of this cocktail that had been given to him by Leslie Bailey. So Leslie Bailey then drives this young lad, Barry, back to this flat in London, where then you have now this sex gang rape. And again, it was stated by Bailey that there were up to 8 men, or it was 8 men, that gang raped, tortured, drugged Barry Lewis, age 6. And again, his body then was discovered in a shallow grave. So when Bailey was in prison, Leslie Bailey was in prison, he did admit, and he was the only one really that admitted to all these cases, and he implicated a lot of people within this, and also a lot of different paedophile gangs, not only the Dirty Dozen gang, which this group belonged to, and others, which are many of them, but also another group, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But the flat they used was the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, and when they'd finished with Barry's body, using Barry like that, and Barry was then dead, or they thought he was dead, they piled him they thought they'd suffocated Barry with a blanket, and then they piled him into the car to take him off to be buried. But Barry wasn't dead. he was still alive. And I think people had seen a child putting their hands up to the car window. He was dying, but he wasn't dead at that point. And then they had to finish their job off, as Leslie Barry says, before then they could bury this child. So both of these murders are awful murders. I think now we should move on to the parts that others also played in it, and how really things in their life then took a turn, maybe for the worst. So we've talked about Sidney Cooke before in other cases, but Sidney Cooke was born on the 18th of April 1927. He's an English convicted child molester, serial killer, and he had 2 life sentences in the end. Even though when he was sentenced to the murder of Jason Swift, or the manslaughter, of Jason Swift, he got 19 years. He's then on appeal. His case was then, or his sentence was then reduced to, I think, 16 years, and he got out after 9 years. So we think, oh, he's out. But there was a lot going on at the time when Cooke got out. So yes, he was out. He was out, and he was then able to then go on to perpetrate other crimes against children. I don't know how, because this man was now in fear of his life. So Robert Oliver, another one of this paedophile gang, this Dirty Dozen gang, which was involved in all 3 of these murders, also then got a lesser sentence. He sort of got away with it, I think, a lot, because he, you're talking about other now convicted criminals that are now giving evidence against each other. I mean, it was quite clear that all of these were doing these murders, and I don't know why the police then either did manslaughter or, in the end give them such low sentences. I think Oliver got 15 years, but he was released from prison after about 8 years. And he tried to change his name, and there's reasons why these paedophiles and these criminals had to change their name, and he then changed his name to Carl Curtis, hoping then that would then help him. But then he was also out on life license, where he couldn't go near any children at all. This person, or these people, were such danger to children, they wasn't really allowed near anyone. And I think with Robert Oliver, he just couldn't help himself. He just couldn't. And again, he was trying to lure children into his home, into his flat, and and he was then put back in prison, and he later died in prison of AIDS. So that was then Oliver. So when we talk about now Leslie Bailey, now Leslie Bailey is the one that admitted it, and we've said this before in other cases about Leslie Bailey. Don't get me wrong, Leslie Bailey was a terrible, terrible paedophile, as was Cooke, as was Reed, as was, and we'll come to him in a little while, Lenny Smith. These were terrible paedophiles, child abusers, sexual offenders. And I think even with Cooke, he had, when he was released from prison in 1998, they wanted to put him in a hostel, which was right next door to a school. There was public outroar in that, and things were going on in the community. But also Leslie Cooke now was the only one now remaining in prison, and he was hanged in prison. They found him hanging in his cell in prison, and it looked like that he took his own life. He didn't, because when the pathologist then looked at his body under autopsy, it was found that he had previously been strangled and then been hung up himself, and so that happened in prison. And he was then, 2 people were charged with the murder of Leslie Bailey. So again, that's him gone. So now we have left out on the streets that Cooke. Now Cooke, at this time, there was as I say, there was a lot going on, and I think in then this mix there was another man that came into it, and another paedophile group that was going on at the same time, and they all had interactions. These people, there was many of them, these paedophile gangs, they all joined up, They all knew what they was doing, and they enjoyed it. So there was a TV documentary, and it's still going today actually. It's a dispatch program, and on the 29th of October 1998, Thames Valley Police began to reinvestigate a series of rapes and other serious sexual offences against boys due to this program. Now, you know, you have to think, the police have now in their, or have had in their interview rooms, they're in prison, they could have got a lot of information from these paedophiles, but they didn't. But it takes then a program like an outside source of Channel 4 on this dispatch program, which is an absolutely fantastic program to watch. You know, their investigating journalists can find out more about what's going on in our communities than the police could. Shocking, really, when you think about it. But they did uncover a lot. Now, Sidney Cooke was at the time, he was released, and as I said to you before, yes, he was released in 1998, but he was in fear of his life, because what happened was, there was another paedophile called Malcolm something, I can't remember his name now, but he was, and he's a separate case altogether, he was a scoutmaster, a prolific paedophile, absolutely prolific paedophile, and he then ran this other paedophile sex ring, and him and Cook, Lenny Smith and all these then were connected in that way. But what happened was, after the death of Barry Lewis and Mark Tydesley and also Jason Swift, you had then the other criminal world of London, not the paedophile world, but the criminal gangs in London, the gangsters of London. And we have some very serious, very powerful gangs in London, and a lot of them are old school gangs which are called firms in London, and they took it upon themselves to put a hit out on these paedophiles, because they didn't believe that justice was going to be served. So this man called Malcolm, who's a separate case altogether, came to his door and was shot at point blank range in the head by some London firm, gangsters, however you want to call it. This then sent shockwaves through this paedophilia, gang, raping, sexual offenders. They just couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that someone could do that to them, because don't forget, these people want to harm. These people didn't mind killing children. These people didn't mind gang raping children. That's what they did. But when they started to be murdered, when they started then to be attacked, they then went to the police for help. Now, Cook spent a year in cells of his own choice in police stations because he was in fear of his life from these gangs that are now after him. Don't forget, you've already got Leslie Bailey that has been hung in prison. Now you've got another member of one of these paedophile groups now been shot at point blank range in the head. People knew who these people were, and they wanted him. Now, at the time when Sidney Cooke, you know, Hissing Sid, was being looked after by police because he had to be, because he would have been murdered if they could have got to him, he could only leave the police station. He was free to leave, but he had to give 24 hours notice so that 2 police officers could escort him wherever he went. So this is with Sidney Cooke, what was going on. But also in 1999, again now after this year of being looked after by police, and literally probably he felt the safest place for him to be was in prison, because sooner or later one of these gangs, one of these members of these firms would have got them, okay, for what they have done. It was coming. But he was rearrested by Thames Valley Police, and he was taken to Reading Police Station because he committed another, even though he was in police cells being looked after by the police. And around this time there was 18 other sexual offence charges, and which occurred earlier on in 1972 to 1981, because now you see people were coming forward, weren't they? People have had enough of this sort of thing, and these kids that then he abused in the 70s and 80s are now grown up, are now coming forward, are now saying, this is what this man did to me. And this case was about two young brothers that he had sexually abused, and he was a terrible, terrible abuser, violent, sadistic abuser. He was also, didn't just keep it to children, he also raped women. And you'll find with a lot of people that do these sort of murders, and where we think of them just as paedophiles, they are not. They are predators. A person who is vulnerable, like a child or a woman or an elderly person, are all in the eyesight, in the mindset of these people, because they're all vulnerable. And he's just a terrible person. So his crimes, now we're talking about England now, and this man, again, don't forget, Cooke was then working in fairs and stuff, so travelling around. So his crimes went from Battersea to Stockwell in South London, Tyne, Telford, Berkshire, Canterbury, Kent, Tyne and Wear, Hatfield, Hertfordshire, Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire, Tring in Hertfordshire, and he was moved from that then cell where they was looking after him, then back into prison. And that's what happened to Sidney Cooke. Again, then he was charged with other crimes. And on the 5th of October 1999, Cooke then pleaded guilty to sexually abusing the two brothers, and on 10 occasions between 1972 and 1973. Some offences he said no to, but the rest of them. So that's really how they got Sidney Cooke off of our streets. So in 1991, the Guardian newspaper branded Cooke, Sidney Cooke, hissing Sid, as Britain's most notorious paedophile. So now let's talk about this other paedophile gang. So police had uncovered a link between this Shoebury sex ring and the paedophile gang that killed these lads. So the Dirty Dozen gang. So there was clear links. Now they only found this link because of a witness come forward. Now again, as I said earlier, these paedophiles, these sex rings, have members, a lot of them. And these members have children, and then them children are brought up in these sex rings. And these then men groom, and women, let's not discount women here, because no one says that a paedophile only has to be a man. And I think there was some women within this group. But, let's carry on with what we know for now, I think. So one of a witness came forward because he was groomed by this Shrewsbury sex gang when he was a young child. And he had come forward because now he's grown up and he wants to say what had happened to him in this sex ring. And he brings in the name then of Lenny Smith, because he says he was constantly threatened with, if you don't do as you're told, you're going to meet Lenny Smith, and then you are not going to know what's happened to you. So Lenny Smith was then linked, as we now know, with the Mark Tilsley case. But then got off, don't forget. He never served any time for their murders. So now we have a person now that in the 1990 that's linked Lenny Smith to these murders as well. Also, he's linked this Shrewsbury gang, sex gang, to the Dirty Dozen sex gang. And now police realise that this man that's come forward has given them evidence to sort of link a lot together. By this time, though, you have Bailey that's now been murdered. You have Cooke saying that Bailey was the mastermind. And I think the police now, because you didn't have and also that you had Robert Oliver, who had now died from AIDS. So Lenny Smith, I suppose, gets this, goes through with it, doesn't he? Really, with these crimes. But this link now, where now the police know that there's more than one sex gang going on, and the difficulty is, I think, with this case, is these are the cases that we know of. This man believes, the man that come forward from when he's been told about his abuse from a young child and brought then into this Dirty Dozen gang, into the Shrewsbury gang, and also joined them up. We are now talking about hundreds of paedophiles, and it is probably thought that many of the deaths or the abductions or the missing children around at that time were linked now to these gangs of sex offenders, these sexual gangs where people would pay to have sex with children, whether they were groomed or whether they were abducted. That's what they were used for. So Smith was linked to all three killings. But he was never prosecuted because, as I said, most of them had died, this, that and the other. But also, these were his fellow paedophiles, weren't they? And they wouldn't give evidence, or they couldn't give evidence, or the CPS said their evidence wouldn't be believed. But Lenny Smith was, though, convicted of other serious sex offences, and he died in prison in 2006. So again, now we have these people that really have got away with murder, because I think only one was convicted of murder, the others were of manslaughter. It's absolutely shocking. So really, I suppose this brings us to the end of the case of Jason Swift and Barry Lewis, and also brings me to the end of having to research these people. It's difficult for me to express to you how difficult it is to read pages and pages and pages and pages of incidents that are concerning these people. But I think it's even harder, I think, to not do it, to not say it, to make sure that these boys didn't die in vain. And as I said to you before, this is why we do these cases, because this shouldn't be forgotten. This still goes on just because these paedophile gangs disbanded. They didn't disband because of the police. They didn't disband because of the public anger towards them. They only disbanded because these were hunters of children, and they then become the hunted. And it was for their own self-preservation that they then went more underground. But this stuff still goes on today. They're still around. They're not going to come to the surface and show themselves, because people, like the people that shot Malcolm at point blank range, that hung Leslie Bailey, are still there, are still waiting. I hope you have found this case interesting, and I hope that it creates discussion and debate on things. I know the content in this video is shocking, but it has to be told. We should never forget about what really goes on out there in the real world, and I think this case really does highlight what goes on and why now maybe these days we're not hearing as much of it. So you know what to do. You can put your thumbs up, hit that thumbs up button down there. You can hit that subscribe button what Lacey puts up there in the corner. You can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook, and it is really great to have been getting your comments. I really enjoy it and I'm really appreciative of it, and also that people are actually watching these videos and are coming back with lots of feedback, and I really am appreciative of that. So thanks for watching, and until the next time, bye bye.